The morning the police walked into my lecture hall, I was telling my students that integrity is the only thing no one can take from you, and I remember thinking later how almost cruel that sounded, because 30 seconds after those words left my mouth, 2 uniformed officers stood in the doorway and asked for me by name in a voice that was calm enough to make my stomach drop, and I felt my fingers tighten around the edge of the podium as if the floor beneath me had shifted and I needed something solid to hold on to. "Dr. Eleanor Hart, we need to speak with you regarding your husband," the taller officer said, and it is strange how a single sentence can rearrange the air in a room, because my students were no longer looking at their notes, they were looking at me, and I knew that whatever was about to unfold would not stay private in the ways that matter. I walked out with them feeling heat rise up my neck and into my ears, telling myself this had to be a mistake, that Daniel had always been careless and selfish but not criminal, that this was probably some misunderstanding about paperwork or taxes. But in my office, the officers laid out printed records and used words like financial transfers and offshore accounts. And then one of them said the phrase that made my heart begin to pound hard enough that I could hear it in my head, that some of these accounts were registered under my identification. I laughed at first, because it felt absurd, and I said my husband could barely keep track of his passwords, let alone run something complex enough to interest law enforcement. And then the shorter officer slid a photograph across my desk, and I felt the laugh freeze inside my throat. It was Daniel at an airport holding a small boy against his chest, not awkwardly, not accidentally, but comfortably, his hand resting on the child's back the way fathers do when they belong there, and next to him stood a woman I had never seen before, looking at him like she trusted him completely, and for a second I could not breathe. Not because I was shocked he had cheated, he had done that before, but because this was not an affair, this was a life. I had survived his betrayals for years by telling myself stability mattered more than pride, that raising Claire in one house mattered more than raising her in honesty. And I had repeated that logic so many times, it felt like wisdom instead of fear. And now, as the officers told me there was also a storage unit under my name and documentation that did not align with his employment history, I felt something inside me begin to shake in a way that was not visible on the outside, but was violent on the inside. They told me not to contact him yet and left me with a card and instructions, and as soon as the door closed, I called Claire, because even in shock, I still believed mothers are supposed to warn their children, and when I told her the police had come to my classroom, she was quiet long enough that my chest tightened, and then she said, "So it finally happened," in a voice that sounded tired instead of surprised, and I asked her what that meant, and she said, "Mom, you can't pretend you never saw pieces of this," and that hurt more than the photograph, because it meant she had been watching us both all along. When Daniel came home that evening carrying takeout like nothing had shifted, I stood in the living room holding that photo, and I saw his face change for just a second before he pulled it back into control. And instead of asking me if I was okay, he asked what I had told the police, and something in me cracked, because that question made everything clear. I walked past him to the coat rack and reached into his pocket without asking permission, and when I pulled out a small metal key labeled with a storage unit number and a tiny pink dog collar engraved with the name Lola, I felt anger rise in my throat so fast it almost made me dizzy, and he grabbed my wrist and said, "Eleanor, you have no idea how complicated this is." And I heard myself answer in a voice that was shaking but steady enough to matter, "I don't need to understand all of it to know you used my name." And in that moment, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number that said, Check his pocket before he lies again." And Daniel went pale in a way I had never seen before. He lowered his voice and told me that if I stepped into whatever that key opened, I would not be able to step back into the life I thought I had. And I stood there, with my hand trembling around that piece of metal, realizing that the life I thought I had was already gone. And for the first time in 40 years of marriage, I told him no, not quietly, not strategically, but clearly enough that even I could hear the difference. I should have gone to the police with the key in my hand and the photograph in my bag, but instead I drove to the storage facility because I needed to see with my own eyes what kind of life my husband had built behind my back. And the entire way there, my hands were shaking so badly on the steering wheel that I had to keep adjusting my grip just to feel steady, telling myself I was being dramatic, that this was probably financial stupidity and nothing more. But deep down, I knew I would not find something small. The facility sat behind a row of warehouses under pale streetlights that made everything look washed out and unreal, and as I punched in the code written on the back of the key tag, I felt something cold move through my stomach because Daniel had always assumed I would never use it. Unit 214 was near the back, and when I slid the key into the lock, I hesitated for a second longer than I meant to, because I understood in a way I had never understood before that some doors change you once they open. The metal door rolled upward with a dull scraping sound, and I stepped inside expecting clutter. But what I saw was order, careful labeled bins, stacked folders, 2 expensive suitcases, and in the far corner a small dog crate with a pink bowl next to it marked Lola, and I had to sit down on one of the bins because my knees were suddenly weak, because this was not chaos. This was a second life organized with intention. I opened one container and found passports and birth certificates with names I did not recognize, then another with printed financial records that ran through accounts tied to institutional systems I knew far too well. And when I saw a university lanyard with my institution's logo resting on top of a stack of files, I felt something inside my chest twist hard enough that I pressed my hand there to steady myself. My name was not just attached to this. My world was. There was a large envelope with my name written across it in thick letters that were not Daniel's handwriting, and when I tore it open, my fingers were clumsy, and I dropped half the contents on the concrete floor. And as I bent to gather them, I saw transaction records, coded emails, and at the bottom a single handwritten note that said, "You raised your daughter to forgive him, and she learned how to lie." And I remember reading it twice because I wanted it to be melodrama, not truth. My phone rang and Claire's voice came through tight and breathless, asking where I was, and when I told her, she cursed under her breath and said I should not have gone alone because this was not just about affairs or money, and I demanded she tell me exactly what that meant. And she said Daniel had been moving people, not officially, not legally, using access points connected to the university system, saying he was helping families navigate broken immigration processes. But the money did not match the story, and the partners involved were not charities. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear her, and then she admitted that he had asked her to access donor databases and administrative channels under the excuse of research collaborations, and that at first she believed him, and later she told herself she was only adjusting information that would be corrected. And as she spoke, I felt a wave of nausea rise, because I realized my daughter had learned survival from watching me stay quiet. The signal cut off abruptly, and I stared at my phone knowing this was not bad reception. And that was when I heard footsteps echoing down the corridor outside the unit, slow and steady, not lost, not hesitant. I grabbed a photograph lying face down near one of the suitcases and turned it over with shaking fingers, and there was Daniel smiling with the same woman and the child seated between them under a banner that read, "Happy Second Birthday." And behind them on the wall was my university lanyard, as if my career had been decoration in his alternate life. I shoved the photo into my bag and pulled the metal door halfway down, and when I stepped back into the corridor, a man was standing there watching me with the kind of calm that makes your skin prickle. "Doctor." "Hart," he said, in a voice that sounded almost polite. "You should not be here alone." And I demanded to know who he was, and he replied that he could be helpful, or he could make things more difficult, depending on what I chose next. And I felt anger push back against fear because I was tired of being spoken to, as if I were fragile. He told me Daniel had been careless, and that people were waiting for commitments to be honored, and that if I handed over the key and walked away, I could remain untouched. And I heard myself laugh in a way that sounded unfamiliar because untouched was no longer possible. When I refused, he leaned closer and said my husband had already chosen who would suffer if this escalated, and that my daughter knew more than I did and was afraid I would discover how involved she had become. And I felt something break open inside me that was not weakness, but fury. He warned me that if I went to the police, I would not be treated as a victim, but as a collaborator, that my career would collapse and my daughter's future would be scrutinized. And as he walked away, he said I had one night to decide whether to save my reputation or destroy everything. And when I reached my car, my hands were shaking so hard I dropped the keys twice before unlocking the door. My phone buzzed again with a message from Claire that said, "He's coming home." And as I stared at those words, I realized I did not know whether she meant my husband or the consequences he had been holding back for years. By the time I got home, the porch light was on like it always was, warm and ordinary, and that normal glow made me feel almost sick because nothing inside me was normal anymore. And I sat in the car for a full minute with my hand on the door handle, unable to move, because suddenly I could hear my own breathing too clearly, and it sounded like panic. When I finally stepped inside, Claire was already there, standing in the living room with her arms crossed so tightly it looked like she was holding herself together. And the first thing she said was, not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What did you find?" But "You shouldn't have gone." And something in me snapped, because that sounded exactly like Daniel, like control dressed up as concern. I told her she shouldn't have known without telling me, and her face tightened as she said she didn't know the address. She only knew there was a place, and that she had been living with fear for weeks because Daniel had stopped sounding confident. And when Daniel stops sounding confident, it means he is hiding something bigger than shame. I pulled the photograph from my bag and put it on the table like a weapon I wasn't sure I wanted to use. And I asked her who the woman was and who the child was. And Claire swallowed hard before saying she didn't know their names, only that the child wasn't Daniel's, and that Daniel had helped fix documents for people who needed clean exits. I felt my vision blur for a second, and I had to grip the back of a chair because the words "fix documents" sounded like a phrase people use when they don't want to say fraud out loud. And I asked her how she knew any of this, and she finally admitted what I had suspected since the message on the note, that Daniel had pulled her into it by asking her to access university systems under the excuse of donor research and partnership grants, and that she had said yes because she trusted him and because she was tired of being the only one who saw him clearly. I told her that wasn't a reason, that was an excuse, and she flinched as if I'd hit her. Then her voice rose and she said, "Mom, you stayed with him." And the sentence landed in my chest like a stone, because it was true, because I had taught her that you endure what hurts you if it keeps the house standing, and I had never once said those words out loud, but she had learned them anyway. I started to speak, and my voice cracked in a way that embarrassed me, and I turned away because I did not want my daughter to see me fall apart. But then I realized she needed to, because she had been falling apart alone for years. I told her I didn't stay because I was strong. I stayed because I was scared. I stayed because I thought leaving would ruin us, and now I understood staying had been ruining us slowly anyway. And Claire's eyes filled with tears. She tried to blink back like they were weakness. The front door opened before either of us could recover, and Daniel stepped inside like he owned the air, and behind him was the man from the storage corridor, silent and calm, as if he had been invited. Daniel looked from me to the photo on the table, and for the first time his face did not settle into charm. It hardened. "This isn't your business," he said, and I heard my own voice answer before I could stop it. "You made it my business when you put my name on your lies." And the words came out louder than I expected, and Claire flinched, as if loudness itself was danger. Daniel told me I didn't understand what I was stepping into, that there were people involved who didn't care about my moral awakening, and that if I exposed him, I would expose Claire. And when he said her name like that, like a hostage, something in me rose that was not reason, but rage. I asked him how many identities he had layered through my institution, and he didn't answer. And I asked him again louder, and he finally said, "Enough," as if my life's work was a tool he could quantify. The man behind him spoke for the first time and said Daniel owed commitments to people who don't accept embarrassment as payment, and his tone made my skin go cold because it sounded like a warning disguised as information. Daniel moved toward the photo, and I stepped between him and it, and he grabbed my wrist in a grip that wasn't violent, but was firm enough to hurt, and in that contact everything I had swallowed for decades surged up. The nights I lay awake pretending not to hear his lies, the dinners I smiled through because it was easier than making a scene, the way I watched my daughter become sharp and distant because emotions were dangerous in our house, and I pulled my wrist free with a force that surprised me. I placed the storage key on the coffee table between us, not because I wanted to negotiate, but because I wanted to change the shape of the room, and I said that in the morning we were going to the police together, that I was done being used as cover, and for a second Daniel just stared at me like he couldn't decide whether to laugh or threaten. Claire whispered, "Mom," like a plea, and I almost wavered. I almost heard that old instinct telling me to calm it down, to keep it quiet, to handle it later. But then I remembered the officers standing in my classroom and the look on my students' faces, and I knew later had already arrived. Daniel's jaw clenched, and then he said something that made my stomach twist, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. "If I don't go with you," he said quietly, "they'll assume I betrayed them." And the man in the doorway didn't deny it. He just watched me like he was waiting to see what kind of woman I would become when silence stopped being an option. I did not sleep that night, not because I was brave, but because every time I closed my eyes I saw different versions of the same future collapsing in slow motion. My career dissolving, my daughter standing alone in front of questions she was not ready to answer, my husband looking at me with that mixture of blame and disbelief, as if I were the one who had broken something sacred. And I lay there staring at the ceiling, realizing that for years I had confused peace with avoidance and stability with silence. Around 3 a.m, I walked into the kitchen and found Claire sitting at the table in the dark, with only the light above the stove on, and she looked younger than she had in years. not sharp, not defensive, just tired, and she asked me in a quiet voice if we were really going through with this, and I heard the fear under her words because going to the police was not a moral slogan. It was a detonator. I sat across from her and admitted something I had never said out loud, that I was terrified, that I had spent most of my adult life making choices based on what would cause the least disruption, and that I did not know how to live differently. And she looked at me like she had been waiting her entire childhood to hear that sentence. She said she had been afraid too, afraid of Daniel's temper when things did not go according to plan, afraid of disappointing me, afraid that if she exposed him, I would see her as weak for having been involved. And I reached across the table and took her hand, because for the first time I understood that my silence had not protected her. It had trained her. When Daniel came into the kitchen just before sunrise, he looked composed but brittle, like a glass about to crack, and he said he would come with us to the police station because walking in voluntarily would shape the narrative, and I felt anger rise again, because even now he was thinking in terms of angles and damage control, and I told him this was not about narrative, it was about truth, and he replied that truth without strategy is just self-destruction. In that moment, I almost faltered, because part of me still respected his intelligence, still feared his certainty, and I imagined turning back, telling the officers there had been a misunderstanding, asking for more time, smoothing it over the way I always had, and the temptation was strong, not because it was right, but because it was familiar. As we drove to the station, the silence inside the car felt heavy enough to press against my lungs, and I watched Daniel's hands on the steering wheel and remembered all the years I had trusted those hands to guide our family forward. And I wondered how many of those years had been constructed on foundations I had chosen not to inspect. When we walked inside the building, the fluorescent lights were unforgiving and ordinary, and I felt suddenly small, not as a professor, not as a wife, but as a woman who might lose everything she had worked for in one morning, and my legs trembled in a way I could not fully control. An officer led us into separate rooms, and I sat down in a chair that felt colder than it should have, and when they began asking questions about the accounts, about the storage unit, about the access points tied to the university, I felt my voice start to shake, and for a second I thought I might say I didn't know enough to answer, that I needed a lawyer, that this had all been Daniel's domain. But then I saw Claire's face in my mind, and I remembered the look in her eyes at the kitchen table. I took a breath that felt like it scraped my throat, and I told them everything I knew, not dramatically, not heroically, but steadily, explaining when I first suspected financial irregularities, when I found the key, what I saw in the storage unit, how my identification had been used, and as I spoke I felt something strange happen inside me. Not relief exactly, but alignment, as if my words were finally catching up with my conscience. At one point, an officer asked whether I had ever benefited from these transactions, and the question stung, because it forced me to confront the possibility that I had enjoyed a life partially funded by things I did not question, and I admitted that I had lived comfortably without asking where certain resources came from, and that silence can be a form of participation even when it is born from fear. Hours later, when I stepped out into the corridor and saw Daniel being led past me into another room, he did not look furious. He looked tired, and there was something in his eyes that resembled disappointment, more than rage, as if he had believed I would always choose him over clarity. I almost reached for him in that moment, almost apologized for not protecting him the way I always had, and that frightened me more than anything else, because it showed me how deeply I had internalized the role of keeper of peace. Claire came to stand beside me and slipped her hand into mine without speaking, and I understood that whatever we were losing that day, we were at least losing it honestly. And as the door closed behind Daniel and the machinery of investigation moved forward without waiting for my emotional readiness, I realized that the greatest battle had not been with criminals or systems. It had been with the version of myself who believed survival required silence. The aftermath did not arrive as a single explosion. It arrived in waves, slow and relentless, each one taking something with it. My position at the university suspended pending review. Colleagues who once lingered after meetings now speaking in careful tones. Students sending messages that were kind but cautious. And I learned quickly that even when you choose truth, truth does not shield you from consequence. Daniel was formally charged within weeks, and the investigation widened in ways none of us had fully anticipated, revealing that some of the identities he helped restructure belonged to families fleeing genuine danger, while others were constructed for financial advantage, and that complexity unsettled everyone because it refused to fit into clean categories of villain and hero. I visited him once before the preliminary hearing, not because I needed closure, but because I needed to see with my own eyes the man I had built my life around. And when I sat across from him in the visitation room, he did not rage or accuse. He asked quietly whether it had been worth it, and I realized he was not asking about prison or reputation. He was asking whether my sense of alignment was strong enough to survive the fallout. I told him I did not know yet, but I knew who I was not willing to be anymore, and he studied my face like he was trying to locate the version of me that used to compromise, and when he did not find her, he looked away. Claire endured scrutiny with a composure that no longer resembled defensiveness, but responsibility, cooperating fully, correcting records, offering access to systems she once entered under trust, and watching her do that with steady hands was both painful and profoundly humbling, because I understood that courage had not skipped a generation. It had been waiting. We sold the house quietly and divided what remained without ceremony, and I moved to a small coastal town where anonymity felt less like exile and more like room to breathe. And on my second week there, I wandered into an animal shelter without planning to adopt anything, only to sit with something that needed comfort. And I saw a small, trembling chihuahua with oversized ears and eyes too alert for her size, and her tag read, Lola, and I laughed softly at the coincidence, before realizing it was not coincidence that moved me. It was recognition. I brought her home because she shook when doors closed too loudly and flinched at raised voices, and I understood that reaction in my bones, and caring for her required patience without silence, protection without denial. Months later, after the hearings began, and the headlines shrank into smaller columns, I received an envelope with no return address containing a recent photograph of the same boy from the birthday picture standing outside a school under a different name, smiling in a way that suggested safety, and on the back were 3 words written in careful ink, "You chose correctly." And I sat at my kitchen table staring at that sentence because it complicated everything. I had exposed wrongdoing, but I had also disrupted pathways that, in some cases, led people out of danger, and I realized that morality is rarely clean when systems are broken, that Daniel had justified his expansion through urgency, and that I had justified my silence through fear, and neither of us had been entirely innocent in how we allowed complexity to excuse compromise. Claire asked me one evening whether I regretted it, whether I wished we had handled it quietly, And I told her regret is easy when consequences are loud, but erosion is quieter and more dangerous. And I had already lived too many years eroding. Now, when I walk along the shoreline with Lola tucked against my chest when the wind sharpens, I think about the morning the police stepped into my classroom and how I thought that was the moment my life shattered. But I understand now it was the moment it split open. Because losing status, losing stability, even losing the man I once believed defined my future hurt deeply. But losing myself slowly would have been worse. I do not know what Daniel tells himself at night, or whether he still believes strategy matters more than truth, and I do not know how history will record what he did, or how institutions will protect themselves moving forward. But I know that silence no longer feels like safety to me, and that is a change I will not reverse. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is not that speaking up saves you from loss. It is that speaking up prevents you from disappearing. And I would rather stand in the open with consequences than live in a carefully maintained lie that slowly erases my reflection.